The purpose of this video is to talk a little bit more about the results and the discussion section, highlighting their importance in the overall report. I want to begin by talking about how science writing or technical writing is a form of storytelling. When you begin to write a report, you may not think about it as necessarily telling a story or narrating a story, but you do want to consider the ways that you're presenting a narrative. And therefore, a report doesn't just present data, it also interprets them. And I'm pulling these quotations from a book by Joshua Schimmel called Writing Science. And here he talks a lot about what makes ideas work and what makes scientific writing successful. And a lot of it hinges on how well you tell your story. So if you give a reader a bunch of data, but you don't tell them what to do with it, you haven't actually succeeded in accomplishing your purpose. So consider the story you want to tell and how your scientific report can function as a narrative. This report is a little different than, say, if you had conducted an experiment in a lab and were writing up the results of that experiment, but at the same time there's a lot of overlap because you have conducted primary research and you want to support what you found with secondary sources. Consider your data as characters. The story grows from the data, but the data are not the story. And here you're thinking about the ways that you don't want to force your data into boxes, but at the same time, you want your story to be rooted in the data and to rely on that data. And that's why the results and discussion sections are so essential to the technical report. And that final point about refraining from imposing interpretation or plot on your data or characters, be really careful about the ways that you interpret your data. Don't try to box your data in based on what you want to see. Be sure to present what is actually there and being careful with your interpretation. The other thing that Schimmel talks a lot about is this idea of sticky ideas. What makes ideas lodge in a reader's brain? What makes them successful? What makes them persuasive? One is that they're simple, but not simplistic. You want to consider the ways that your ideas are straightforward and you give your reader something to grab onto. The second is that they're unexpected. They present new questions or interpretations, and this is where you find that gap. So you talk a lot about what's been said, but what hasn't been said. When you find something unexpected, a new question or a new interpretation, you're going to hook your reader in and ask them to take a look at what you present in a new way. The third thing is concrete. When your ideas are rooted into something that the reader can grab onto or a concrete concept, they're able to understand it better and are more persuaded by it. If it's abstract or really out there and it's not concrete or clear to them, they're not going to find it to be very compelling. Next is credibility, and this is where you as the speaker comes in, your ethos. So you want to make sure that you're basing it in data, that you're being a credible writer, that you are not misrepresenting your information, and that you're getting your reader to trust you. So this is where secondary sources come in handy because they allow you to establish your ethos or your credibility. And that's why you really want to cite a lot of sources. In your introduction, you've set up the brief lit review that gives an overview of the literature as pertains to establishing the background and context of your report. But then in your discussion section, you return to those secondary sources as a way of supporting your data and your interpretations. The next thing is that it taps into emotions or scientific curiosity. An idea that is sticky will appeal to the reader on an emotional level. And that can, again, be curiosity, it can be other compelling reasons. And I think a lot of you have proposals that do tap into this emotional concept. And it can be really useful to keep that in mind, that emotions aren't necessarily antithetical to technical reports, but you have to be able to present that emotion in a way that's compelling within what's appropriate for a scientific or technical setting. And finally, stories. Ideas that are sticky are coherent modules. They present a narrative. So what story are you trying to tell your reader? And if your reader can hear that story, they're going to remember it a lot better. I present all this information as just background. Again, Jonathan Schimmel's book, or Joshua Schimmel's book, is really helpful, really useful. If you're going to continue in the sciences and are interested in writing, take a look at this book. I'll post a link to it. The next thing is talking about structure, and a scientific report has 4 components: an opening, a challenge, the action, and a resolution. And again, this goes into this idea of narrative. And here's just a quotation from Schimmel. The OCAR functions as functions are as central to the scientific paper as they are to a work of fiction. A good paper or proposal describes the larger problem and central characters, which is the O, in your introduction. It frames an interesting question, which is the C, and that also is usually in your introduction. It presents your research plan, developing the action, which would be your methods and your results. And it leaves the reader with an important conclusion about how our understanding of the world has changed as a result of the work, the resolution. And that would be your results and your discussion as well. Primarily the discussion with regard to the resolution. So when you talk about your results, you have conducted an experiment or you have data, you use the results section to present those results. Now some of you might decide to combine your results and discussion section, so keep in mind that you're going to do this work, but perhaps in a couple of different ways, depending on if you separate your results from your discussion or if you combine the two together. First thing that a results section should do is keep in mind that you're telling the story, that you're narrating what you found with your primary research. So don't focus on your secondary research here. Focus on your survey, your interviews, your other primary data that you've gathered. You also want to use visuals to clearly convey this data. And while we'll talk about visuals in another unit, visuals are a really powerful tool to communicate results in a way that's user-friendly and quick for the reader to grab a hold of. Finally, you want to begin a preliminary interpretation, but you're focusing mainly on presenting the data to your reader. And remember that the data don't speak for themselves. Explain what they mean. So don't just throw a bunch of numbers out there for the reader. Talk a little bit about what the numbers mean within a context. If you just throw numbers out there, your reader doesn't know what to do with those. If you're keeping your discussion section separate, then your discussion takes what you've done in that results section and interprets those results to make an argument. So in this section, you want to focus on advancing an argument as supported by your results and your secondary research. So you don't want to just repeat what you've already said in the results section. So you want to move out and move beyond just stating the findings. You want to talk about what those findings mean, why they're important, and how they are maybe supported by the secondary research or push against some of the secondary research that you found. This is where you can incorporate more of that source material that in a way that makes sense to advance your argument. So you really want to think carefully about how to organize this section. It should have a logical organization, and you want to begin by giving something that previews what the discussion will cover, and then have a clear organization. Have 2 or 3 main points that you are developing using your results, using your secondary sources, and is organized in a way that best tells your story. Most of you will likely use a topical organization approach instead of a chronological. And the Essentials of Technical Communication book talks a little bit more about some of these organizational methods you can use. So take a look at that chapter as well. This section is the heart of your report. It's really where you make your case, you convince your reader of your conclusions as supported by data. If you skip this section, if you don't develop it fully or you don't give it its due, it's going to really hurt your ability to be convincing, to communicate your findings, to really use the report to accomplish what you want to accomplish. And since this is a recommendation report, you will have a final section of recommendations, and that again should emerge from this discussion that you've had. So your discussion might be where you explore the various aspects of what you will then recommend. So you want to think about how those sections can flow together: results, discussion, conclusion, recommendations. You have a lot of options with how you can organize those sections, so talk to your groups and keep in mind what the story is you want to tell and how it would be best to communicate what those findings are. So good luck, and I look forward to reading your sections.